This is Geoff Simon. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Dakota Energy Association.
Thank you very much for joining us today. A couple of reasons to have him on the program. One is to talk about some of the things affecting oil and gas. We just had a legislative session in North Dakota wrap up, and a couple things came out of there of interest. And then there's that state of Washington ban of, not ban, but just some new regulations that might turn into a ban, I guess. And then also, you were just down in a conference in I believe it was Oklahoma. So let's start off with that a little bit. I took a look at the itinerary. Actually, I knew about a half a dozen people that were down at that conference. In fact, I'm interviewing an attorney from Norman, Oklahoma. She does a lot of water issues, and you know this. Boy, water is one of the most underreported, under-talked about. And I don't want to use the word issue because I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill here, but it doesn't take too many tea leaves to see that water is one of the big important issues going on in the oil patch right now. Would you agree with that or disagree? Just, I guess we'll start off comments on water and then down to the conference. How's that?
Okay, yeah, well, you know what they always say, water's for drinking or whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, I think is the old line.
Yeah, it is.
But, water was a big issue this past session. The Water Commission budget is nearly $1 billion, and that's going to fund water projects and as well as flood control projects in North Dakota, both of which are a really big deal here. Produced water was kind of an issue as part of the pore space legislation that came out of this past session. That kind of turned into a sort of a sleeper issue. Not too many people saw that one coming.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, what it amounts to is a Supreme Court decision in 2017 took into consideration legislation that was passed in 2009 that dealt with, actually it was contemplating, the idea of carbon sequestration, the whole CO2 storage idea. And it took a look at that in the context of oil and produced water, wastewater disposal wells, and potentially pulled into play the prospect of requiring oil companies to compensate landowners for oil that is discharged or re-injected back into the same unit from which it's produced, which, it's a long-standing kind of common law sort of thing that companies are allowed to do that. They do have to pay for surface disturbance, but not for the use of the space underground to inject the water. That was resolved. So,
how about down at that conference down in Oklahoma? I noticed there were a few Bakken presenters, specifically from North Dakota. Two or three off the top of my head. Did the Bakken and North Dakota have a pretty good presence down there at that conference that you attended in Norman, Oklahoma? IOGC. What was the whole?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. It's basically the National Association of State Oil and Gas Regulators. And it was in downtown Oklahoma City is where it was happening at.
That's it. Sorry about that. Not Norman, Oklahoma City. Okay.
The main public program really kind of kicks off with something that's kind of cool. It's a round table where each of the regulators from the states and provinces, there were, I believe, 5 provinces from Canada presented as well there. They all get 6 minutes, to kind of give a rundown of what's going on in their state. And obviously Lynn Helms, our guy here from North Dakota, the Department of Mineral Resources, was there and talked about, what we got going on in North Dakota. I mean, we're kind of boom times right now, 1.4 million barrels a day, 2.7 BCS of gas a day. And they all talked about, kind of the state of their industry. A lot of them are looking at abandoned wells. It was really remarkable. I think probably a third of the presenters talked about these abandoned wells that a lot of times they just don't have a handle on where any of them are. I believe it was the state of Ohio. They actually found one underneath a school.
No kidding.
There was kind of a methane seep going into the school, and it was actually, the school had been built over an abandoned gas well.
Well, I was talking to a guy who was down at the conference, and he told me about another gentleman who in this Ohio thing where they're using this $27,000 drone basically, plus to go find these abandoned wells. So was there a lot of talk about the drones and or UAS, UAV, whatever the correct terminology is? But North Dakota, of course, being one of 6 test states helping set the rules and regulations, surveillance, oil and gas being one of those. Was that mentioned down there at all, kind of some of the drone talk?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a big part of the technology. That's really kind of, what a lot of the states are trying to do is just to get a handle on it right now. I think North Dakota pretty much knows where they are. I mean, the drilling just started here in the 1950s, so they have a pretty good handle on it. But some of these other states, I mean, these are pre-turn of the century, and I'm talking the 1800s to 1900s turn of the century wells that have been there for more than 100 years. But if they haven't been properly plugged, they're a hazard, and a lot of these states are still trying to get a handle on that. It's kind of remarkable.
I saw that EERC, the Energy Environment Research Center, was represented down at the conference too. What were they talking about?
Yeah, well, Jay Almley was there from.
It was Jay. Okay.
Jay leads the project called iPipe, Integrated Pipeline Technology. I can't recall exactly the acronym, but it's it's using technology to identify and to prevent possible leaks, pipeline leaks. That's really the target of it. It's this kind of Shark Tank sort of project where they look at some of the best ideas and then fund them through the Oil and Gas Research Council here in partnership with, I think they have 8 different industry partners now, looking at ways to, to prevent pipeline leaks. Pipelines are 99.999 something like that % safe, but there's always an issue. So they're looking at technology and ways to do that. It's a really a fantastic project, and they've got some promising prospects to identify these leaks before they happen, looking at pipe integrity and some things like that. They've got golf ball sized probes. They can actually, there's sensors that go through the pipe, and then when they bring them out, they're full of data that can be interpreted to identify potential hazards. They're using satellites. There's a company called Satellytics. It's really quite fascinating, and it's a growing project. It's a multi-year project, so it's gonna go on for a little while longer.
Anything about big data going on? Because a lot of the stuff that you were talking about, of course, leads to big data, however you want to describe it. That's been a term in the industry for about 5 years. It's growing, and you know how it goes. That stuff's exponential. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we just might start hearing about it as the new normal. Is just that sort of thing. Much like how the UAV talk has been going. Pretty soon we're going to be able to pinpoint specific, blight on a potato plant, and a little remote censored real-time robot will go out and perfume mist the potato blight, and that'll save a small fortune on pesticides and everything else. How advanced is the big data talk, I guess? Was there any of that talk down there? Just from what you were saying, I was going, oh, well, they're just layering in big data right now.
Yeah, they really are. Yeah. A lot of the companies talked about their IT efforts and modernizing their database. Some of them are using, relatively old technology, and they're looking. The regulators are looking at, I think a lot of your listeners, Jason, are probably familiar with the Frac Focus website, where they kind of built a clearinghouse on hydraulic fracturing technology and disposal and all sorts of information. Well, the oil and gas regulators are looking at building a database of kind of best regulatory practices to kind of get a handle on this, what they're doing in terms of using technology and analyzing data to spot trends, perhaps. And it's all fascinating. Technology is, we all know it's growing exponentially, and it's a continuing challenge to kind of keep a handle on it. But it's definitely a talk among the industry regulators.
Well, for me, it's the validation of, and you know this because you were around back in the day of when the John Gibsons of One Oaks and the Harold Hams and the James Volkers of Whiting would make regular appearances out to the Bakken and talk about the paradigm shift happening in oil and gas. This was back in 2014, probably, maybe 2013, where they were openly just saying this is a paradigm shift that's going on. And this big data is part of that, because what you're talking about now is next year or the year after, all of a sudden at the click of a button, you're going to have all this regulation data just like I said, at the click of a button, that you're going to make these decisions in real time for people. It's going to be amazing over the next 2-3 years. What's going to happen in oil? I don't think people understand the industry is just in the infant stages right now.
Well, true, and that especially I think applies to completion technology.
Totally,
We've
absolutely.
had some major changes. I mean, just in the past 2-3 years here, there are wells, and granted, it's good geology in North Dakota that they're dealing with, but there are companies that are bringing on wells that are unbelievably bringing 10,000 barrels per day of initial production. It's just an astonishing amount of oil that's coming out of, you maybe have heard about that in an offshore well, but for an onshore well to produce 10,000 barrels a day is remarkable. But it's just how far they've come with, completion technology and hydraulic fracturing. It's more precise. They know, where the formation is. They stay in the heart of that formation. It's just amazing. They're talking about, right now, getting between recovery rates of 15 to 20%. And, when EOR comes down the road, enhanced oil recovery, in a decade or two, it's in the development phase now, but, there's a day when we're going to get a whole lot more of the oil out of those formations. So the industry is going to last here in North Dakota for many decades to come.
I know a few years ago I used to run ads with my son talking about how, it's a first generation company. My son's going to take over because that's how long the Bakken shale play is going to be. And, he goes to industry events. He was at the Williston Basin Conference a couple years ago. He goes to the Bakken barbecue every year with me. He goes to all these public oil and gas events, is getting to know the people. And he's only 13 now. And, and the reason for that is I truly believe that these interviews and this program and this brand and everything is going to be all part of the next 30 to 40 years, because that's how long the industry is going to be with what we know with the current technology. Now, when we start integrating in what's going on up in the ERC and the Bakken with, say, some of the technology they have going down in Midland, Texas, where they're trying to take the natural gas that's being flared down there and turn it into a way to make water to irrigate the desert. Can you imagine once that technology gets figured out and then other shale plays can integrate it in? That's what I love, is that like what the Bakken is doing is eventually going to end up in other shale plays. That's kind of the idea, right? Is that yeah.
The technology it just continues to advance. Who knows what's coming down the road, but for the keep it in the ground crowd, I think they're sort of in denial if they think we're going to be somehow abandoning the use of oil anytime in the near future. There's just no substitute for the energy density that you can get out of a barrel of oil. I mean, you imagine trying to fly a heavy cargo plane or move a locomotive on electricity. It just isn't going to happen. You need that density of that fuel right now, and there just is no alternative being developed. So that's why I say the industry is going to be around for many decades to come. I think your son's grandchildren will still be using oil. So,
I agree. I mean, at the very least, it'll be a dominant niche. In fact, I don't even think it'll be a niche in the next 100 years. We're so far from getting off oil and gas because it's just so much a part of our life in so many different ways, from transportation to construction to, even our currency is very much plastic based. But
and speaking of plastic, that's the other thing that people don't often think about, that a big portion of that barrel of crude oil is turned into products that we use every day, plastics and various forms of nylon and all kinds of different synthetic type. You would think they're synthetic, but they're not. They're made from organic material.
You're going to get a kick out of it. We're, of course, non-political. Whenever we talk a little politics, it's generally after something has been done, and we bring on somebody like yourself who tracks this stuff on a day-to-day basis. And there's enough programs out there that cover the day-to-day. So we want to just find out what happened and then how to process it and move on. So we don't cover a lot of the political stuff in terms of that, day-to-day type thing. But the one thing that we do believe, and this is not a political statement, it's a fact, that the religion of environmentalism has gotten so extreme that they're out there in crazy land. And I'm not trying to be bombastic or sensational. My evidence is this, and you'll get a kick out of this because you know how hard we try not to be political here, so this is going to sound political, is you have two presidential candidates, legitimate presidential candidates. Now, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are considered legitimate presidential candidates within the Democratic Party. Now, whether their Democrats are legitimate or not, that's a whole different argument. But for argument's sake, you have two presidential candidates that are talking about in their platform, we want to ban drilling. That isn't an actual insane comment. To me, that is like the guy with the Merlin head that runs for president every year talking about dragon legislation. That's the same exact thing. That I can't believe the media would actually give Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren a platform after they come out and publicly say, I'm going to ban oil and gas. Now, I get it's fun to be involved in politics and everything else, but I got to ask you, Mr. Geoff Simon, is that a crazy statement to say I'm going to ban oil and gas?
Well, I don't know if it's crazy. It's pretty darn stupid. But the idea. I think Bernie Sanders has said, yeah, he wants to ban hydraulic fracking. Well, a president can't ban. That would have to be an act of Congress that would do that in the first place. So it's sort of outlandish to begin with. But I mean, you consider the alternative here. I mean, I don't think you'll find anyone that will argue that oil isn't essential to our modern society. There is just absolutely no way modern society can function without oil. It provides 96% of our transportation needs in forms of jet fuel, diesel fuel, gasoline. So what's your alternative to that 96% right now? You've got a few electric cars on the road. So, I mean, here's the choice. You can get your oil from domestic production, or you can have it come in a tanker from Saudi Arabia, and then you can fight foreign wars and continue to worry about instability in the Middle East, things like that. That's really the choice here. I think that's the difference we've seen between the Trump administration and the Obama years is that, Trump has really unleashed domestic production in this country to the point where, we're literally energy independent here. We don't have to worry about what goes on in Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or another of these countries where we have been dependent on oil. That's the real political question that needs to be, that's the political reality of this thing.
Well, and for me, this is where we're going with it. We actually, at the Crude Life, we have a thing this summer coming out called the Earth's Champion that I actually believe, and I'm not kidding, I believe this. The real champions of the earth right now is the oil and gas industry. They're the only ones that are truly trying to invest in technology to continue the way of life and make the planet greener. I think that the environmentalists have gone so far extreme, much like, there's a lot of right side people too that have gotten extreme too. So it's kind of a balance, if you will, to where they're no longer even trying to get rid of plastic bags anymore. It's just, all right, get rid of drilling. It's just like they're not even worried about a compromise anymore. And that scares me that you've got two presidential candidates that can just feel confident enough to make, sure, crazy might be a bit strong, but outlandish, I think, would be more of an accurate term. Unrealistic is definitely, it'd be The Walking Dead without zombies in 3 days. And, but when you look at what's going on in Colorado and now with the state of Washington, there is some concern within the environmental movement to where they're getting a lot more foothold, to where I think the oil and gas industry really needs to do a job of promoting right now, because they are legitimately really trying to save the planet, whereas other people are pointing fingers mostly. That's just from what I've seen over the last probably 7 years covering this industry on a day-to-day basis. You're pretty involved with that. Do you think I'm going off the deep end, or have I got something to it there?
You are right on target. And I'll tell you, just, we mentioned that oil and gas conference. Lynn Helms, our industry regulator here in North Dakota, used the term consumer states, and it was in the context of what we'd mentioned at the outset of the interview here about the Washington state legislation. Really, the consumer states, particularly those on the West Coast, they have a choice here, and it was pointed out in the debate over that legislation out there. The legislation we're talking about it wouldn't, as you say, necessarily ban crude oil imports by rail, but it could potentially curtail them if they were to ramp up in the future. But the choice really for Washington State, again, there is, do you want this crude from domestic sources, where it's creating American jobs and people are paying American taxes, or do you want it to come in through Puget Sound on an oil tanker from the Middle East? I mean, that's really the choice there. And Bernie Sanders, you can get your oil from Saudi Arabia if you want, but I'll take American crude.
Well, not only that, but you've seen this firsthand because you live out there. And, for me, I grew up on the eastern side of North Dakota, Fargo, Minneapolis I was born in, but spent most of my time in North Dakota. That's why I went out to the Bakken and lived out there for a year, so I could embed myself in the industry and figure out the day-to-day how it works. And it only took me about 3 seconds to realize the oil and gas industry is about the last essence of capitalism truly alive in today's economy. They don't get a lot of subsidies. Unfortunately, farming, you do. And so it's a little bit hard to say that. Whereas oil and gas pay their fair share in taxes and then some. They also give their fair share of donations to the nonprofits and then some. And they still seem to have money left over for the T-ball team, the local church event, and a lot of other things that they get hit up for. And so to me, it just seems like they're the last bastion of capitalism. And that's what actually drew me to the whole industry. And to see that still alive out there it's so amazing. And I think that gets underreported too. I really do. And I think people need to be more aware of that. And you're out there on a day-to-day basis. Do you see that still happening out there?
Oh, there's enormous amounts of capital invested. I mean, the industry is investing literally millions and millions of dollars a day. Lynn Helms had a figure here earlier. I think to date, I would say, the industry has invested something by now, probably between 130 and 150 billion dollars in North Dakota. I mean, that's putting capital at risk. Nowadays, it's a little bit more predictable. It's not so much exploratory as it is actually just production, because they know the oil's there and they know how to get it out of the ground. But I mean, it makes such an enormous contribution to the economy of not just North Dakota, but the entire country. We have extremely affordable energy. Gasoline is most places now somewhere between $2.50 and $3 a gallon. That's just incredible that we can produce a useful commodity like that for that price. But then consider the tax revenue. I mean, at today's production and today's price of crude in North Dakota, the oil industry is probably going to pay in a single year about $3 billion in taxes. So, to say it isn't important and that it's not making a huge contribution to the American way of life would be very disingenuous. And to get to the idea that you would want to eliminate that, that's that is kind of crazy, Jason.
Well, that's where I'm going, because really, if you dig deep into this thing to where, okay, let's ban. Well, in Colorado, the governor came out and called it the war on oil and gas. He said the war on oil and gas is the term he used. That scared me, because that means that it's, there's a, what's the word I'm looking for? Organization. There's an organizational effort being handed here. And then when I see what's going on in the state of Washington, and then these consumer states, that's a very good term for it. That is a very good term for it. And my concern is, though, that I don't think they understand the way that the economy works. And you remember, I think you were at the Petroleum Council's annual meeting when Stephen Moore was there from he's a economist. He's a regular on Fox as a correspondent. But he had a slide up during his presentation where it showed that the mining industry, the oil and gas industry, the only one that's had a net gain of jobs over the last 10 years. So all the technology talk, all the farming investment, all the millennial investment, everything did not have a net gain of jobs at the end of 10 years. It was only the mining industry. It was because of the oil and gas hydraulic fracturing movement. That said a lot to me. That meant that in a big body of work, the oil and gas industry has been carrying a lot of cafes and T-shirt shops, and you know what I mean by that? All those quality of life type of businesses. So go ahead.
Well, those dollars recirculate in our economy. I mean, that's the kind of the message by making energy affordable. People have more disposable income for all the other life's pleasures. It's one of my avocations, I guess you might call it, is I spend a little time on Twitter kind of trolling the environmentalists out there.
Ooh.
You know, it's kind of fun when just to kind of make fun of them, because they're just so so out of touch with what's really going on out there. And to point out the fallacy of their argument that somehow we're going to live without this. Are you kidding me? I mean, consider where you're going to be without gasoline. And I mean, the people leading those consumer states, if they're going to step up and stop using gasoline and diesel and jet fuel, well, then I'll maybe start listening to them. But until they do that, I mean, they're just being hypocrites.
That's one of the things that we're doing this summer is with the Earth's Champion. We're going to be promoting and educating, more of educating, that, like what you said, that today's environmentalist has changed. They've changed. Okay, Ed Begley Jr. can come on our program any day of the week. Ed Begley Jr. drives around in a methane garbage-powered car. That guy's walking the walk, talking the talk. When I went out to the DAPL protesters, the person tried to serve me a Keurig coffee cup. Exactly. I left the interview. No, thank you. Absolutely not. We have experts on this program. We don't have hypocrites. And so that really opened my eyes to the modern day protester. And then you saw, of course, the garbage that was left behind at the DAPL protest. That was awful. Absolutely awful.
$1 million cleanup.
$1 million, exactly. And it was garbage. It was not compostable, like cardboard drinking straws. No, these were plastic, things they picked up at the grocery store. And then, these were convenient plastic things, like a Keurig coffee, and so...
Wasn't quite a super fun site, but it was a big mess. That's for
sure. And not only that, but then you start looking at like electric cars, most of the electric cars are powered by coal. And so if you're driving around an electric car talking about how great you're treating the environment, and then you're turning around and demonizing coal, well, you better take the mirrors down in your house. And then that. And then like you take a look at an iPhone. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, an electric car, you got to talk about lithium mining and copper mining and everything else that goes into an electric car too.
And that's where I was going with the iPhone, was that the today's protester does like what you do. They go around and they troll people, right? Except for what they're doing is nothing to help the solution to the planet's problems. They're drinking Keurig coffee. iPhones take 28 rare minerals. Okay, I'm sorry, elements. 28 rare elements. And that's what we're talking about, the batteries and the electric cars. And so the people on the oil and gas side and the innovation side, they're not the ones pointing fingers at the people that are actually trying to solve the problems. It's the ones that are talking about the environmental movement as this great way of life. Those are the ones who are actually causing more problems than solutions in my eye. Now, I believe I have a lot of evidence, so that's why I'm saying this is not a political statement from the Crude Life's point of view. This is a fact, and we're going to go out and we're going to educate that fact this summer in a very fun way. And we'd love your help because you know exactly what we're talking about.
Exactly.
So, go ahead.
I mean, the fact is, Jason, the evidence is there in science. It's science and economics. I mean, that's the downfall of the environmental organizations. I think the science, so-called science that they use has been so vastly corrupted. It's, the whole climate groupthink thing is just unbelievable now that there are people out there that think carbon dioxide is causing hurricanes. It's just, it's utter nonsense. But, scientists are dependent on government revenue. The science that promote that level of activism are dependent on it. And you can't cut through that mentality. These people are not looking at real objective science. They're not considering rational economics when you talk about energy and where you're going to get it and how it's produced and its net contribution to society. We need to get back to those fundamentals of good science, good economics.
Well, and common sense seems to help too. There was a time where the oil and gas industry and the environmentalists were working together. I mean, you don't have to dig too deep into an oil and gas company to see that they have renewable energy departments and they have research and development, because they understand that they want to make money too, and there's a demand out there. And But when you start looking at the state of Texas, I don't know if they got into this much down at the conference you were at or you've been following, but all those McMansions down there that put up solar panels in the last 3 years that they've been trying to track, none of them made money. None of them. They all costed them money. So all they did was subsidize themselves to look trendy and be kind of cool. And they openly admit it now. All that was nice hubcaps on their car because it did nothing for their energy bill.
Well, what we have to, what I think society has to recognize is that we have a clean environment in the United States because we can afford it. If you don't have a prosperous economy, you can't afford to do the research that's going to lead to that breakthrough. You can't mandate some sort of technological breakthrough by banning what we have now. It just doesn't make sense. We just need to support ongoing research if we're going to have these breakthrough technologies. And in North Dakota, our folks, we devote a lot to research. We've got a lignite research council, oil gas research council, and a lot of research goes on at the universities in the valley over there, Grand Forks and Fargo, North Dakota State and UND. They're doing all sorts of research into energy and looking for better ways to do things, and agriculture too, for that matter.
Brought up a good point that I should bring on a buddy of mine who's been traveling to China the last 20 years, and that's what he talks about. He goes, you'd be amazed at how much that country has cleaned up. He goes, when I first went there, you couldn't even walk across a bridge because the rivers smelled like raw sewage. And, some of the areas in the city were just so polluted with smoke and that sort of stuff. Well, we've sold them our intellectual property. We've consulted. We've gone over. And the nice thing is that we are helping different countries clean up their deal. There's a number of books out there that talk about the ethical argument for oil and gas that really just talks about bringing third world countries out of the third world. And quite honestly, if you look at it from that perspective, you don't need to dig much deeper than that.
Well, just in the past 30 years, the portion of the global population that's in dire poverty has dropped from, it was about 30%. Now it's less than 10%. A lot of these areas have been electrified, and it's largely attributable to the development of fossil fuels in those countries. The only way you're ever going to clean up is if you can afford to do it. You have to have affordable energy, and these other sources just aren't going to deliver that. If you don't, you look at a third world country, they look at the environment in terms of consumables and flammables. What can I harvest and what can I burn to keep warm? That's, modern society doesn't do that. We look at ways to use fossil resources efficiently, effectively, cleanly, and, everyone benefits from that.
Geoff Simon, Western Dakota Energy Association, on the line with us, wrapping up here as we concluded the 2019 legislative session in the state of North Dakota, which his organization follows very closely. They've got a weekly newsletter. Of course, you can always sign up for. They give you a great little snapshot of week in review of news and quick links of different things as well. Talk to me about some of the few things that we need to keep an eye on for the next year or two till the next legislative session. Some things that oil and gas people need to be aware of here now in the Bakken.
Well, I would say, over the interim, probably one of the most interesting topics to follow is going to be a study of what to do with the legacy fund earnings. We've got a legacy fund in North Dakota from oil taxes that have been, it was a measure on the ballot, and we've got a permanent fund now. But the earnings from that can now be spent or invested or something with them. This is the first biennium, 17-19, where that's available, and there's a lot of ideas out there about what we should do with that. So that'll be part of an interim study. I think people will want to watch that one pretty closely.
Is that the one that the library is getting a lot of press with?
Well, that was another thing, but that was the governor had proposed using legacy earnings to put in a state contribution to match private sector dollars for the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library.
Yeah.
As it turned out, the money that they put in there did not come from the legacy earnings. But
okay.
That project is there's private fundraising effort underway, and hopefully within the next 3-4 years we'll see that facility open Theodore Roosevelt National Park, just outside Medora.
I'm curious about that one. Just a little sidebar, being a native of North Dakota, of course. This got a lot of traction, and so I'm curious to see how it's going to turn out. I think it will. I think it'll go through, and I think it'll be a nice addition out there. And you know how people are. It's like when Dickinson put up the rec center. Some people were against it. Now they love it. Williston, some people were against it. Now they love it. And so I think this might be a similar thing, that more good will come out of it than bad. I have no idea. All I know is it got a lot more press than a lot of the other stuff. And mostly I think because the governor was championing it. He was a big pusher behind this Theodore Roosevelt Library, really, wasn't he?
It's an exciting project. Yeah, the governor was fully behind it. In fact, his budget to use it. But we're off and rolling with it. I think talking about the interim, just one other topic I would mention that is going to be worth watching. For particularly those folks in the oil patch, is how we're going to pay for school construction in the West. These districts, we've seen a transition in the workforce. It was as the boom took off. In the first 5 years of this decade. It was a very, very transient workforce, and now things have settled down. Housing's much more affordable and available. A lot of those workers are bringing their families here, and they have children, man. Lots of kids going into the schools, but it's the communities in the West are having a struggle trying to keep up with classroom facilities. Williston had a failed bond issue just this week. Dickinson had a failed bond issue. And I think part of the mentality is, we see all this oil tax revenue generated, which is supposed to be in lieu of property taxes. So folks are reluctant to raise their own property taxes when all this oil tax revenue should be devoted to school construction. That's
quite a sign if both those communities rejected that school bond.
Yeah, we've got two more coming up next week. The rural district in Williams County outside Williston has a bond issue next week, as does the Nesson School District, which is the community of Ray, which is just north and east of Williston.
Is there any early speculation on that? I have no idea. I'm not plugged in at all out there, but the Dickinson and the Williston one voting no speaks to me. Are the rurals primarily following suit with that, or is it just too early to tell they're a wild card?
Well, it's those districts in the core that are seeing the growth. I really couldn't say, what kind of support the two votes next week will have. Watford City was able to pass a bond issue back in January to build a new elementary school. Yeah. And they're going to have another bond issue coming up sometime within the next few years here.
Oh, wow.
For a middle school there, because right now they've got the large high school next to the Rough Rider Center there. That's one of those magnificent facilities you mentioned. But they've got seventh graders at the high school now, and eventually they're going to need a middle school because the high school is going to fill up. They had 200 additional kids in the building this year in a very small town. That's, you're almost adding an elementary school just with that number.
Well, I could tell you right now that the state cannot give enough money to Watford City. That town probably needs more legitimate support than probably most of the other communities, just because of how fast they're growing.
That's my message, Jason. That's why the Western Dakota Energy Association exists, to make sure people understand that the communities out there are impacted by energy development. And, those communities support the energy industry. So the state of North Dakota and our legislature needs to support those communities.
That's the one thing I wish everybody on the east side would seriously just go out to Western North Dakota for a day or two and just spend some time out there and realize how much that side of the state contributes to the other side of the state. I know that is Jade Stone and Brent Boger that did the recent the dependency study, the tax dependency study. That was an eye opener. It's like 50% of the revenue or budget or something. It was just an eye opener.
And more than 50% of our general fund revenue comes from oil taxes, and if a lot of it wasn't put into the legacy fund, that percentage would be even higher. So. It funds projects all over the state: water, flood control, colleges, universities. The money is distributed widely, and you can find that on our website, ndenergy.org. It's still front and center there. If you want to just click on the tab, and you can find where those oil tax revenues have been spent around the state.
Well, and I think the reason why I'd like people from the east to go over there is I do think there's enough fair-minded people that when they look at how much revenue and support and et cetera comes from the west. And then they realize, all you got to do is go about 30 minutes west of Fargo, Grand Forks, Wahpeton, draw a straight line up and down the state, and there's 60% of the population. That's the discrepancy of the population and kind of the swaying of the political power and all that, I think would just go away if people on the East were a little bit more educated with how important that stuff is on the West. And I think the studies help, like the one that was done this past January. And I expect you guys will be doing more of these, right? I know NDSU does one every, I don't know, was it 7 times in the last 10 years and that sort of thing. And I think it helps, and the industry's sticking around, and it's not going anywhere like it did in the 80s, and that's going to help too. I do see a day where the West will be getting more money from the state, don't you?
Oh, I would think so. And we could spend a little time on another whole topic where we're about to head into a census. I just attended a meeting yesterday on the 2020 census, and that is going to cause a little bit of a political shift here. The districts in the West are going, they've gained population, so they're going to have a little bit larger political voice when the next legislative session comes around.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that'll actually be a good thing for the state. I really believe that.
I mean, it's hard to quantify it, but I mean, you can basically assume that the city of Williston is going to have a new state senator. It's grown that much. Fargo's grown in the east, and Grand Forks to a little lesser extent, and a lot of the eastern farming counties generally have lost population, but Dickinson has grown. All the communities in the western part of the state have grown, so there will be. And
you know this, being in North Dakota, people don't like to talk about some of the things if there's a problem in agriculture, especially on the east side of the state, because it's all agriculture. And the dairy industry has been consolidating. The farming industry has been consolidating. It's no secret that not everybody's buying a new combine every year. Strauss in Fargo went out of business because the farmer's not buying a suit every year and the kids are wearing jeans to church. The times have changed. And the nice thing that hasn't changed is the oil and gas industry, because those people are still buying their new trucks every year, and they're still buying because they're not subsidized and they're not consolidating. They're growing, and you're getting more startups out. I mean, like when I think about what Kevin Black and Credence Energy Services is doing out there in Minot, North Dakota, that's incredible. That's absolutely incredible, some of the stuff they got going on out there. Do you know what I mean by that? To where some of the other industries have been changing, but the oil and gas industry isn't. They're still trickling that money down the way that the trickle-down economy is meant to be done.
Well, I tell you what, probably the best example of that is the city of Minot, I would say, because Ward County, where Minot is located, has almost no oil production. But if you look around Minot, there are literally dozens of oil field service companies there. The industry, it's not just those people that are working at the wellhead. There are dozens and dozens of different types of service industries that support the oil industry, from, oil field clothing to pipes and pumps and lubricants and on up. I mean, you name it. It's a very big spin-off kind of thing that you see. I mean, the industry just ripples throughout the entire economy of Western North Dakota.
Well, wrapping up, what should people know about Western Dakota Energy Association and what you guys are keeping tabs on, and get that newsletter on their inbox?
Yeah, well, you can go to our website, ndenergy.org, and sign up for the newsletter on there, or you can read the back issues there too. You can also catch up on our legislative reports. They're all posted online as well, to kind of recap it for yourself. But we're just going to continue looking out for the cities, counties, school districts, townships that are impacted by energy development in the western part of the state. That's our job.